Presently, I am the postdoctoral associate for the Lincoln Theological Institute, which is a posh theological outfit which looks at the relationship between Christianity, contemporary ethics, and kind of civil society. So we're interested really in how Christian ethical and political commitments get translated in the real world. So recently the Institute did a project on theology and climate change. That's kind of an ongoing thing. We've done projects on civil society. We've done projects on Christian theology and David Cameron's big society. So we've done a lot of different things.
Who's Kant and what were their theories?
I think the thing to first understand about Kant is that he's from what we might call the Enlightenment canon. He tries to define morality for a more secular age. Kant is trying to say, can we create a moral system where we're completely agnostic on the question of whether there is a God offering us divine commands? So what Kant does, one of his sort of most important philosophical moves, is to say, okay, let's take God out of the equation, what's left? And for Kant, what's left is human reason. So his ethics is based on the assumption that reason is the sort of foundational starting point for all ethics.
What is the categorical imperative?
The categorical imperative is the idea that essentially the basis of goodness should be your ability to recommend an action to be universal. So you know that it's good if you can apply it in all situations at all times. Yeah. So Kant says something like, yes, think that you would will something to be a universal law. So another example you could use is quite a kind of classical one in philosophy. What if you have a parent who has a starving child and steals bread for that child? Now Kant would say, based on the categorical imperative, you shouldn't do that. Because if we all start stealing, society will break down. So the key thing for Kant, who represents the what we call the deontological form of ethics, or duty ethics, is that you shouldn't be so concerned about sort of context or agency or emotion. What you should be really interested in is what is the fundamental, irreducible, universal principle. And that should be applied, he argues, irrespective of situations.
How do these problems relate to healthcare?
Doctors Without Borders, they're an organisation, they're an international organisation, and they're made up of healthcare workers, so doctors, nurses, and they go all over the world and they treat people regardless of political status, religion, ethnicity, or the particular territorial troubles. So these health workers would say, it doesn't matter what the situation is, where you are, who you are, there are ethical principles of universal access to healthcare, which is based on solidarity and compassion, and they in effect should override any kind of particular claims that you have as a citizen.
So, what are the problems with Kant's theories?
So we can divide them probably into practical considerations and issues of principle. So let's take issues of principle first of all, and then we can move on to practical issues. So issues of principle, the problem with deontological theories, so duty theories of ethics, is that essentially they're not very concerned about sort of the context, or they're not very concerned about the result of an action. They just tend to be interested in the moral integrity or intention of the agent. If you have this idea that it's all about intentions and you ignore consequences, well, people can actually have really good intentions, but they can often produce, really, really awful results. To be honest, Kant ethics is lovely, particularly if you're an individual, because you can say, I'm very clear that this is how we should do things. But how do you practically deliver that? So this issue of kind of practicality is a big issue, I think. In the case of, say, HRV and some other services, there may well be a defined sort of public interest justification which actually allows you to have that kind of Kantian license. So a public interest example would be, we are going to offer you this medication to ensure that a particular disease or debilitating condition does not spread to the population at large. So although it appears to be very sort of universalist and liberal and cuddly and magnanimous, often healthcare professionals will have to actually apply a kind of, we're going to move on to this later, but a utilitarian approach, right, to healthcare, where we say, actually this is about the greatest good of the greatest number, and it's about public interest. But what you can do to kind of carry people with you is say, no, it's Kantian, it's lovely, it's, But really, we have to kind of question the extent to which they are really following a kind of Kantian point of view.
So what is utilitarianism and who are the main theorists?
Utilitarianism is generally known as the kind of doctrine of people like Jeremy Bentham. You also have the great disciple of Bentham, John Stuart Mill. Yeah. But actually, one of the important things to notice, as we'll see kind of as I describe the theory to you, that actually utilitarian ideas have been going around for a long time. It goes back even further to ancient Greece. So there was a guy who was an Athenian. He was well known for liking, nice little quiet garden parties. He was called Epicurus. And Epicurus argued that actually the core of our moral reasoning should be the fact that we should avoid pain and we should actually maximise pleasure. Bentham, he's still kind of quite basic, he's quite sketchy, it's still very much about what critics of Bentham have called the kind of ethics of the farmyard. So the idea that really it's about kind of, animal passions for Bentham, it's about just, heat, light, food, warmth. Mill, though, who is kind of a disciple of Bentham, kind of goes in a different direction. He says that actually there are different kinds of pleasures. So not all pleasures are kind of physical, sensual pleasures. You also have intellectual pleasures. Yeah.
What are the central ideas to utilitarianism?
The core thing, however we're defining it, the basic distinction of utilitarianism, the basic aim, is maximising pleasure, minimising pain. Bentham defined it as the greatest good for the greatest number, right? Which is really, really key. So it's not just what you like and what I like, because actually they might vary quite considerably, but it's what society in general finds appealing.
Excuse me, can I ask you a question? What's the question again? Can you give us an example of how utilitarianism has been applied?
One way you could look at it, there's actually a story, this is a true story about J.S. Mill. When he was 17, he was actually a campaigner because his father had sort of trained him in utilitarian principles. And one of the things that he campaigned passionately about was the right of women to access contraception. Because in the 19th century, it was actually considered to be immoral for women to use contraception. The thing that really moved Mill on this issue when he was 17, he actually found a basket of a dead child on a doorstep that had been strangled. So in this situation, you'd had a poor family who could not actually afford to feed their children, and so babies were routinely strangled or thrown down a well or exposed just so the family could actually make ends meet. So he said having a restriction on contraception for women was irrational and it was causing general misery, so the way to sort it out, to maximise happiness for people, was to say, right, let's provide contraception for people. The thing that utilitarians really want to get across as an ethical theory is we don't have to accept kind of arbitrary social restrictions. We don't have to actually accept the kind of language of the duty ethicists like Kant, who say, something's wrong because it's wrong. Utilitarians say, no, we have to evaluate the consequences of an action before we can really say whether something's right or wrong.
What are the problems with utilitarianism?
I think the biggest problem with utilitarianism really is its kind of majoritarian bias. So essentially what it's really interested in is what the majority of people are doing. But the problem with that, of course, is that, as we know from looking at sort of healthcare outcomes, different groups may have vastly different kind of issues in terms of issues about diet, life expectancy, culture and so on. So if you're just saying, the majority of people in this culture live a particular way, what you'll end up doing is directing funding towards the most common conditions, say, as a way of actually meeting, the greatest good for the greatest number. But that might leave a large minority of the population who may have, other sets of health conditions or problems actually sort of not catered for.
How does this problem relate to healthcare?
So in the UK, there's an organisation. It's called it's NICE, isn't it? So one of the sort of jobs of NICE essentially is to evaluate the sort of cost effectiveness of drugs in broad brush terms, but also to actually determine whether patients should have access to it. So one of the big problems that NICE has been under fire continually, actually, I think throughout its whole existence, is that it often has to make the decision: should a patient get a drug which could actually sort of prolong their life, but the actual cost to the health service is prohibitive. This is difficult because it comes back to your big your big issue, which we keep on coming back to, which is the finite, the finite status of our resources. It may well be that we'd have to cut, maternity services or other things. So this kind of demonstrates a kind of clear contrast. So although we think of these theories as kind of abstract, we say, oh well, there are these things, there's utilitarian and deontological approaches, and we think, they're just kind of philosophy textbook stuff. But actually this stuff has a real impact on public debate, on what people think about ethics, and more importantly, how healthcare workers deliver their care to patients.